The photograph had rested in a wooden drawer for more than a century, untouched, unseen, and almost forgotten, until the day a museum donor dropped off a small box of family belongings that once belonged to a man named Albert Turner. At first glance, the items inside looked utterly ordinary: a pair of spectacles with thin wire frames, a glove missing a button, a pair of rusted cuffs, and a single folded photograph wrapped in brittle brown paper. The museum volunteer almost placed the box aside for later processing, but something about the way the photograph was wrapped felt intentional, as though the family, all those years ago, wanted to protect it from time itself. She unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a black and white image from 1911, showing a family of 7 standing in front of a simple wooden farmhouse. The scene looked peaceful, frozen in a moment that appeared completely harmless. A father in a stiff collar and vest, a mother holding a baby in her arms, 3 older children arranged neatly in the front row, and a teenage boy standing just behind them, half hidden in the shade of a tall oak tree. It was the kind of picture thousands of families took during that period, a picture meant to capture a quiet moment of unity. But even in that first moment, when the volunteer held it under the museum's white lights, she felt something register in her chest, a quiet, shapeless unease she could not immediately explain. Something about the faces, the posture, the arrangement, it all felt balanced, yet strangely uncomfortable. She tried to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than fatigue, but curiosity tugged at her, pulling her eyes back to the upper corner of the photograph where the teenage boy stood. His expression was stiff, his face a little too blank, as though he were trying to stay perfectly still, even for a camera that already required long exposure times. She moved on to the rest of the family, examining each face, each pair of eyes, each faint smile or half-hearted grin. But the longer she studied it, the more that uneasy feeling grew. That she set the photograph aside for a moment and continued cataloging the donated items. But every few minutes, without intentionally doing so, she found herself glancing back at the image. It felt as though the photograph wanted attention, as though it wanted someone to finally look closely. Eventually she gave in completely, pulled a chair under the bright desk lamp, and leaned in until the details of the image filled her entire vision. The family's clothing was typical for early 1900s rural America. Faded cotton dresses for the girls, suspenders for the boys, and a high-neck blouse for the mother. The father stood with the rigid confidence of a man accustomed to holding still for long exposure photographs. The baby in the mother's arms had that soft, unfocused look most infants had in photos of that era. Everything seemed normal. Every element of the image belonged exactly where it was. And yet, beneath all of that normality, something subtle felt off. She began examining the children one by one. The eldest daughter wore her hair tied back with a ribbon, and she stood with her hands clasped politely in front of her. The younger daughter held a small doll with a fabric dress that had long since torn at the hem. Beside them stood a boy of around 8 or 9 years old, thin and lanky, his expression somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. The volunteer studied his eyes first, then his nose, then his mouth. Then she shifted her gaze to the teenage boy behind the group. He looked older by several years, maybe 15 or 16, and he was positioned as though he weren't meant to be the center of attention. At first there was nothing connecting the two boys except their resemblance, which wasn't unusual. Brothers often shared features. But something about this resemblance felt too precise, too exact, that the volunteer leaned even closer, squinting as she compared the boys' eyes, the angle of their noses, the tight line of their mouths. It was unsettling how closely they matched, not in the way siblings resemble each other, but in the way 2 photographs of the same person matched. She examined the younger boy again, then the older boy. Every line, every shadow, every tiny imperfection seemed identical. The realization arrived slowly, like a cold draft moving through her body. She looked again, then again, holding the photo so close to her face that the edges blurred. Her breath caught, asterisk, asterisk, it was the same face. Not similar, not related, not matching in a gentle, believable way, that it was the exact same face, duplicated, aged slightly, repositioned, and placed into the same photograph twice. Her heart slowed to a crawl as she lowered the image and stared at it from a distance, hoping the effect would fade, that her mind was simply playing tricks on her. But the more she tried to view the photo objectively, the more impossible it became to deny. This wasn't just a pair of brothers who looked alike. These 2 boys had identical features, identical proportions, identical expressions, not similar, but perfectly mirrored expressions that no 2 humans, regardless of relation, would naturally share in a candid portrait. The volunteer felt a chill run across her skin. She knew photographs from the early 1900s often came with imperfections, light leaks, double exposures, and occasional scratches. But this was none of those things. This wasn't a printing defect. This wasn't a shadow. This wasn't a blur. The younger boy and the teenage boy had different clothing, different heights, and different body proportions, but their faces were the same, in the way a face captured twice in one camera exposure might appear, except their bodies weren't double exposed, only their faces. For several minutes she simply stared, unsure how to process what she was seeing. Eventually, she brought the photograph to the museum director, a quiet man named Harold, who had spent decades examining hundreds of old images. He had seen everything: tintype reflections, ghosting effects from low shutter speeds, dust scratches that mimicked shapes, even double-exposed plates. But when the volunteer handed him the photograph, he became still, his eyebrows tightening as he studied the children. He examined the younger boy first, then he looked at the older boy for a long, silent moment before turning the photo slightly to adjust the light. The room felt heavier as the seconds passed. When he finally spoke, his voice was unusually soft, as though he did not want the photo to hear him. "These faces match," he whispered. "Perfectly," he hesitated before adding. "And that is not possible." He took the photograph into his private office, locking the door behind him for several hours. When he finally emerged, he looked pale, unsettled, and older than he had when he entered. He carried the photo with both hands, almost gingerly, as though afraid it might change again if he wasn't careful. He approached the volunteer and spoke quietly, asking her to accompany him as they searched through the donor information to locate any surviving relatives of the Turner family. It took them days, a long chain of emails and calls, but they eventually found a woman named Caroline who lived 2 states away. She was a far descendant of the Turner bloodline, and she agreed to speak with them over the phone. Caroline had never heard of the photograph. Her family had very few records left from that era, but when they described the image, the names on the back, and the year, she paused for so long that the director wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, in a strained voice, she began to speak. She said she knew the Turner story, or at least a version of it whispered among older relatives, a version that children were told not to repeat outside the family. "It began," she said, "with the birth of the second son, the one in the photograph. His name was Daniel. According to Carolyn, her great-grandmother used to claim Daniel wasn't like the other children, but not in the way parents usually described uniqueness. She said Daniel seemed to appear in places before he actually walked into them. If they looked for him in the house, they would sometimes see him in a doorway, only to turn and find him standing behind them instead. Her great-grandmother claimed she saw him sitting on the porch at the same time she saw him climbing out of the barn. It became a hushed family belief that Daniel was somehow duplicated. As the family tried to keep this behavior secret from neighbors, more unusual events continued. Daniel's older brother once swore he saw Daniel climbing a tree while another version of him helped their mother hang laundry. Their father dismissed the talk whenever it surfaced, blaming childish misconceptions or tricks of the light, but the whispers continued among the siblings. One child claimed Daniel spoke to himself in a soft voice behind the barn, as though 2 people were having a private conversation. Another insisted that sometimes Daniel's face looked slightly different from one moment to the next, as though his expression didn't align with what he was feeling. The story became darker when Daniel turned 9. Caroline explained that one early morning the family found him unconscious near the edge of the woods behind their farmhouse. He had no memory of what happened, but his younger sister claimed she had seen 2 Daniels walking into the trees the night before, one following the other. The next day, something changed in him. He became quiet, unfocused. He would stare at walls for long minutes, as though listening for something beyond sound. He seemed to drift through the house like a fading shadow. When the family finally took him to the town physician, the doctor noted that Daniel's heartbeat sounded strange, as though it were echoing faintly inside his chest. Caroline went silent again before continuing. She said the Turner parents tried to hide Daniel's condition. They stopped allowing the children to talk about it. They kept him near them at all times, and they stopped having visitors. But no matter what they did, the strange occurrences continued. Some days the children swore they heard footsteps in the attic that matched Daniel's pace downstairs. Other days they heard 2 voices whispering the same sentence at once. The worst incident came shortly before the photograph was taken. Caroline said her great-grandmother heard her mother scream from the kitchen. She ran in and found her standing frozen, pointing toward the back door. Outside it in the yard, Daniel stood with his face raised toward the sky while another Daniel stood by the barn, looking directly at them with an expression she later described as empty, like his eyes didn't belong to him anymore. The two versions stood still for several seconds before the one near the barn blinked, turned, and disappeared into the shadows. The family never spoke of it again. When the day came to take the family portrait in 1911, the Turners insisted on keeping the children close. The photographer positioned them in front of the farmhouse, arranging everyone neatly. The photographer later wrote that the children seemed tense, especially the two boys, who wouldn't stop glancing at each other, but he managed to get a single clean exposure, a single moment frozen forever. Caroline said the family rarely looked at the picture afterward because it reminded them of a time they wished to forget. Over the years, the children grew up, moved away, and started families of their own, except Daniel. He never grew beyond 14. One summer he disappeared into the woods and was never found again. The town searched for weeks. His father followed every creek, every hidden path, every hollowed log, but there was no trace, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not a sound. It was as though he dissolved into the forest itself. When Caroline finished telling the story, she asked the museum director a single question. Does he look the same in the picture? The older and younger one? Does it really match? The director hesitated before answering, because he knew the truth would unsettle her. He finally said, yes, they are the same, and there is no photographic explanation for it. Caroline said nothing for a long time, but the director heard her breathing unsteadily. Then, in a trembling whisper, she told them there had always been a rumor passed down quietly through the Turner line that Daniel was never one child, that he had been born with a shadow self, a second presence that mirrored him so perfectly that even the family couldn't always tell which version stood before them. Some believed this second self was a mere hallucination created by frightened children. Others believed it was something darker, something that entered the family through grief or tragedy. But the version that frightened them most was the belief that Daniel was simply born in two places at once. After the call ended, the director and the volunteer looked again at the photograph, but now with a deeper understanding that made the image even more unnerving. They saw the younger Daniel in the front row, stiff and tense. They saw the older Daniel behind the group, his face half in shadow. They saw the identical expressions that no two human brothers would share. They saw, for the first time, the slight tilt of the older Daniel's head that matched the younger perfectly. They saw the identical angle of their eyes, the same faint tightening at the corners of their mouths. They saw two versions of a child who was never meant to be, photographed together. For days the director kept the photo locked in his desk drawer. He didn't want it displayed yet. He didn't want questions from visitors or journalists. He didn't want to fuel rumors about ghosts or double exposure myths. What troubled him was not the idea of a haunting, but the possibility that the photograph captured something that science could not explain, something that the Turner family had tried desperately to hide. Yet the camera had recorded with perfect clarity. Late one evening, long after the museum had closed, the director sat alone in his office with the photograph under the lamplight. He studied the older Daniel's expression again. This time he noticed something he hadn't seen before, or maybe something he had simply ignored. The older boy's eyes seemed faintly misaligned, not crossed, but slightly unfocused, as though he was looking at something that was not in the frame, or worse, as though he wasn't looking at anything at all. The director felt his skin crawl. He gently touched the edge of the photograph and whispered a quiet apology, unsure why he felt compelled to do so. In the days that followed, he conducted more research on the Turner family, searching through census records, birth certificates, and property documents. He found Daniel listed clearly as one child, not two. There was no record of twins, no hidden births, no infant deaths. But when he examined the family signatures on an old property deed, he noticed something odd. Daniel's name appeared twice, written in two different handwritings. One version of the signature was steady and neat. The other looked rushed, shaky, almost frantic. No one had any explanation for why the same child would sign the same document twice. Word slowly spread among the museum staff that the photograph held something strange. Some workers refused to look at it. Others stared at it in fascination, drawn to it the way one is drawn to a mystery that has no answer. The volunteer who first discovered it admitted privately that she found the older boy's face unsettling in a way she couldn't articulate. "It doesn't look alive," she whispered one evening. "It looks like he's wearing the idea of a face, not a real one." Eventually, the museum decided to digitally scan the photograph to preserve it. When the high-resolution scan appeared on the screen, the director felt his stomach twist. The details were sharper now, the boy's eyes clearer, the matching lines more undeniable. But what disturbed him most was a subtle, nearly invisible shadow that ran behind the older Daniel's neck. as though something had been standing just behind him, something the camera captured only partially. When the director zoomed in, the shadow seemed to stretch in a direction that didn't match the tree behind him or the angle of the sun. It looked like a faint outline of a hand resting on the boy's shoulder, but a hand that did not belong to any member of the family. He closed the file immediately. Over the next week, he began dreaming of the photograph. He would find himself standing in the Turner family yard, watching them pose for the camera. The wind would rustle the grass. The children would shift their weight nervously. The photographer would raise his instrument. And then he would see Daniel too, Daniels walking slowly toward one another, merging until only one remained. In the dream, the merging made no sound, but the silence was worse. As days passed, the director stopped sleeping well. He avoided the photograph. He avoided the drawer where he had stored it. But no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the image held something more than a visual anomaly, something the Turner family had lived with quietly, something they feared, something they buried. Finally, one evening the director decided he needed closure. He pulled the photograph from the drawer and placed it under the lamp again. He studied the older Daniel for a long time, then he whispered aloud, "Which one are you?" The room felt colder. He looked at the younger Daniel and whispered again, "Which one are you?" He wasn't sure why he spoke to them. Maybe he felt the photograph wanted recognition, or maybe he simply wanted the unease to stop, but the truth settled heavily in his chest. No matter which version was standing where, one of them did not belong. One of them was not a brother, not a child, not human in the way the rest of the family was human. One of them was a reflection made physical. When the museum eventually displayed the photograph behind glass, with a simple plaque reading Turner family, 1911, visitors often commented that the image felt unsettling, though most couldn't explain why. They would pause, tilt their heads slightly, and move on. But a few visitors looked closer. They would linger, their brows furrowing, leaning in until their noses nearly touched the glass. Then they would step back abruptly, confused, and walk away without asking questions. The museum director kept a visitor's journal. One afternoon he noticed a handwritten note left beside the exhibit. It read, in shaky letters, "Why is the same boy standing in two places?" He closed the journal quietly. The photograph remains in the museum today. It has been scanned, restored, archived, and analyzed by countless experts who all offer technical explanations that never fully address the truth. Some blame exposure blending, others claim it's a printing error, but none can explain why the older boy's face is an exact replica of the younger's, or why the shadows do not align, or why the Turner family never spoke of the picture again. And none can explain what the camera captured in that brief moment in 1911, two versions of a child, who should have been only one. Even now, when visitors look at the image, many describe the same sensation of feeling that someone in the photograph is watching them back. Some say they feel drawn to the older boy's eyes, unable to look away. Others claim they feel a second presence behind them as they stand at the exhibit. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is this. The older boy in the image has no recorded birth date, no record of existence, no evidence he ever lived.